We're going to cover Joshua chapter 5 and chapter 6 in this video. We're going to learn about how God would really perform another miracle so that the people could defeat the fortified city of Jericho with walls that were incredibly high. I think the Bible says 40 feet high. We'll find out in a moment. But they were incredibly high. It was one of the most powerful cities that they would fight, and they had to fight it first. And a lot of times the biggest obstacle that we face whenever we're stepping into something God has for us is faced first. And when we get through that, the rest of it, God just coasts us through. It's really interesting, the picture that's displayed for us. Chapter 5, verse 1. Now when all the Amorite kings west of the Jordan and all the Canaanite kings along the coast heard how the Lord had dried up the Jordan before the Israelites had crossed over, their hearts melted in fear, and they no longer had the courage to face the Israelites. They didn't want to fight them. They didn't want to fight them anymore. Verse 2, at that time the Lord said to Joshua, make flint knives and circumcise the Israelites again. So Joshua made flint knives and circumcised the Israelites at Gibeath Haderloth. Apparently, when they were in the wilderness, there were certain things that God had called them to do. The sign of circumcision, it was an outward marking of something inward that had taken place. They would do this to their males, that God had called them to do this. Apparently, somewhere along the way, they must have stopped doing this in the wilderness. And God says, hold on, you need to make sure that you are consistent and specific with what I required of you, with what I asked of you. When you apply the word of God to your life, even if you don't think in your flesh or in your mind that it's necessary, if God says it's essential, we need to do it. It says, now this is why he did so. All those who came out of Egypt, all the men of military age died in the wilderness on the way after leaving Egypt. All the people that came out had been circumcised, but all the people born in the wilderness during the journey from Egypt had not. So that generation had not. The Israelites had moved about in the wilderness 40 years until all the men who were of military age when they left Egypt had died, since they had not obeyed the Lord. For the Lord had sworn to them that they would not see the land he had solemnly promised their ancestors to give us, a land flowing with milk and honey. So he raised up their sons in their place, and they were the ones Joshua circumcised. They were still uncircumcised because they had not been circumcised on the way. And after the whole nation had been circumcised, they remained where they were in the camp until they were healed, because it takes a couple days to get over that. Verse 9. Then the Lord said to Joshua, today I've rolled away the reproach of Egypt from you. So this place has been called Gilgal to this day, which in Hebrew is believed to translate to mean roll. On the evening of the 14th day of the month, while camped at Gilgal on the plains of Jericho, the Israelites celebrated the Passover. The day after the Passover, that very day, they ate some of the produce of the land, unleavened bread and roasted grain. The manna stopped the day after they ate this food from the land. There was no longer any manna for the Israelites, but that year they ate the produce of Canaan. God says, I'm not going to keep supernaturally providing food for you anymore. I have supernaturally provided for you the land that I have given to you and promised you. This is an incredible transitionary moment for the people of Israel. Basically, God says, I sustained you to this point, and I have given you what you need to move forward. You're going to have to do your part to walk in all that I have for you. Really, it's a principle that we can take and apply to our lives. God will give us what we need, but we have to do our part too. Verse 13, we begin to talk about Jericho. Now, when Joshua was near Jericho, he looked up and saw a man standing in front of him with a drawn sword in his hand. Joshua went up to him and asked, are you for us or for our enemies? Neither, he replied, but as commander of the army of the Lord, I have now come. Many people, myself included, believe that this is a Christophany, or an appearance of Christ in the Old Testament. It says a man, but then it clarifies that he is the commander of the army of the Lord, or he's the angel of the Lord. And he says, I'm not on your side, I'm not on their side, I'm on the Lord's side. You say, why is this significant? In principle, it teaches us something that we need to understand, because we often get caught up in this thing called binary thinking. I'm right, you're right, I'm wrong. What if we're both kind of right? What if we're both kind of wrong? Well, what if we really came to the conclusion that God is always right, and if I don't align with God, then I'm wrong? And basically, the angel of the army of the Lord, or Jesus is talking to him and says, I'm not on your side, I'm not on their side, I'm on God's side. The better question that we need to ask ourselves is not, are you on my side? Catch this. It's, am I on God's side? Similar to how in the New Testament, Jesus was talking to this man and he said, who is my neighbor? And Jesus told him the parable of the Good Samaritan. And basically what Jesus said to him was, are you a neighbor? Sometimes we ask the wrong questions. It says, then Joshua fell face down to the ground in reverence and asked him, what message does my Lord have for his servant? The commander of the Lord's army replied, take off your sandals, for the place where you're standing is holy. And Joshua did so. Chapter 6. Now the gates of Jericho were securely barred because of the Israelites. No one went in and no one came out. Then the Lord said to Joshua, "See, I have delivered Jericho into your hands, along with its king and its fighting men. March around the city once with all the armed men." Do this for 6 days. Okay, so this is going to sound kind of crazy, but for 6 days, they marched around the city. They didn't do anything, but they marched around the city. This was a faith walk, a faith journey, if you will. He says, "Have the 7 priests carry trumpets of ram's horns in front of the arks. On the 7th day, march around the city 7 times with the priests blowing the trumpets. When you hear them sound a long blast on the trumpets, have the whole army give a loud shout. Then the wall of the city will collapse and the army will go up, everyone straight in." God says, I want you to know, we're not doing this like all the other nations do it. You're going to walk around that city for 6 days, and they're going to make fun of you. They're going to mock you. They're going to pick on you, but you're going to stay silent, and you're going to do it by faith. On the 7th day, you're going to walk around 7 times. And when you're done, you're going to give a shout, and the Lord is going to destroy the walls of the enemy. So important that we realize that it wasn't done in the natural, but they trusted in the supernatural. They trusted in God. So Joshua, son of Nun, called the priests and said to them, "Take up the ark and the covenant of the Lord and have 7 priests carry trumpets in front of it." And he ordered the army, "Advance, march around the city with an armed guard going ahead of the ark of the Lord." When Joshua had spoken to the people, the 7 priests carrying the 7 trumpets before the Lord went forward, blowing their trumpets, and the ark of the Lord's covenant followed them. The armed guard marched ahead of the priests who blew the trumpets, and the rear guard followed the ark. All this time the trumpets were sounding, but Joshua had commanded the army, "Do not give a war cry. Do not raise your voices. Do not say a word until the day I tell you to shout, then shout." They were very specific and intentional to follow what God had very specifically and intentionally had told them to do. This is a theme that you will see in the Bible that we need to remember for our life. Verse 12. Joshua got up early the next morning, and the priests took up the ark of the Lord. The 7 priests carrying the 7 trumpets went forward, marching before the ark of the Lord and blowing the trumpets. The armed men went ahead of them, and the rear guard followed the ark of the Lord, while the trumpets kept sounding. So on the 2nd day, they marched around the city once and returned to the camp. They did this for 6 days. On the 7th day, they got up at daybreak, and they marched around the city 7 times in the same manner. Except on that day, they circled the city 7 times. The 7th time around, when the priest sounded the trumpet blast, Joshua commanded the Lord, "Shout, for the Lord has given you the city. The city and all that is in it are to be devoted to the Lord." This is going to be important later because someone's going to violate this. He says the city and all that it is in it is to be devoted to the Lord. Really, it's a picture of a first fruits. It's a picture of a tithe. God's going to give you the promised land. God gives us 100%. But the first, it belongs to the Lord. The first 10% of everything that I make belongs to the Lord. It's his. It's sacred. It's holy. He asked for it. He's worthy of it. He says, don't touch anything in the city. Only Rahab, the prostitute, who we learned about earlier, who preserved the spies. Only Rahab and the prostitute, all who are with her in her house, will be spared because she hid the spies we sent. But keep away from the devoted things, so that you will not bring about your own destruction by taking them. Don't take what belongs to God. It only hurts you. But if you give to God what belongs to God, it will bless you and it will bless your home. Otherwise, you will make the camp of Israel liable to destruction and bring trouble on it. In many ways, what we do is we bring about destruction into our own home when we don't do what God has called us to do. All the silver and gold and articles of bronze and iron are sacred to the Lord and must go into his treasury. When the trumpet sounded, the army shouted, and at the sound of the trumpet, when the men gave a loud shout, the wall collapsed. So everyone charged straight in, and they took the city. They devoted the city to the Lord and destroyed with the sword every living thing in it, men and women, young and old, cattle, sheep, and donkeys. Joshua said to the 2 men who had spied out the land, "Go into the prostitute's house and bring her out and all who belong to her in accordance with your oath to her." So the young men who had done this spying went in and brought out Rahab, her father and mother, her brothers and sisters, and all who belonged to her. They brought out her entire family and put them in a place outside the camp of Israel. Then they burned the whole city and everything in it. But they put silver and gold and the articles of bronze and iron into the treasury of the Lord's house. But Joshua spared Rahab with her family and all who belonged to her, because she hid the men Joshua had sent as spies to Jericho, and she lived among the Israelites to this day. At that time, Joshua pronounced this solemn oath: "Cursed before the Lord is the one who undertakes to rebuild this city Jericho. At the cost of his firstborn son, he will lay its foundations. At the cost of his youngest, he will set up its gates." And we will learn later, I believe it's in 1 Kings chapter 16, someone tries to rebuild the city, and what Joshua prophesies does actually take place. So the Lord was with Joshua, and his fame spread throughout the land. God was with him, and God established him, and God built his name. Don't live to make your name great. Live to make God's name great. Live to make God's name great, and he'll take good care of you. Don't worry. You'll be blessed. Be blessed today.